Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight, we have a very exciting episode. We've been waiting to do this episode for a long time. We're actually going to be doing it on the Mandela effect. And in short, it involves many memories that you've had of past things in your childhood, things you grew up with that are completely different than you remember them. It has to do with perhaps celebrities you remember dying that are still alive and so on. And it all comes down to different theories with different realities that have come through, possible time travel. It's a really, really wild topic. So we're excited to do that. And the other thing that I want to throw out there, besides the usual, is that we finally have our official Effed Up Stories t-shirts for sale. They're extremely, extremely limited. I can't stress that enough. So if that's something you want, head on over to the official site. And as well, because I didn't want to have a 20-minute intro, because we have a lot of new stuff coming, guys. I've done up a separate video that shows the t-shirts, other things that we're going to be doing, and how you can get it. And as well, we're giving away 2 free t-shirts, one to our eccentric donator who of which without this wouldn't have been possible, and one is going out to a random donator. So if you were one of those people, you could very well have won a free t-shirt. So be sure to check that video out. I'll see if I can put a link in the description to this video. And of course, if you have an effed up story of your own on the paranormal or whatever, we'd love to get that from you, get it onto the website and into a podcast. So to do that, you can go on to the official website, effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. And just go to the menu, hit submissions, fill out the form, hit submit. We have it. We'll get it online and into a podcast. And with that said, let us jump into the exciting topic of the Mandela effect. So in a nutshell, the Mandela effect refers to an enormous amount of people who remember details, not just wrong, but very specifically so. And that it might not sound like much in itself, but what we are going to get at here is household terms that you will most likely very vividly remember in one of 2 ways. And the way that it is currently in our history books, or the way that, it was, is very different likely from the way that you remember that. So, this could be, again, it could be the reality of different dimensions or realities splitting off as things happen. It could be a multitude of things. And if this sounds really confusing, then just sit back as we start taking baby steps through the examples, because, personally, it blew my mind. And many people that I've explained this to, it's blown their mind. So if you're not familiar with it, it's possible that it's going to blow your mind. So let's just get down to probably the most popular example. And the most popular example that I think possibly, and Ryan, you can jump in here if you can think of a better one, but it's probably the Berenstein Bears.
Well, I guess the obvious one to mention first before we get
Mandela,
into is Mandela, since the effect is named after him. And, it's a situation where a lot of people remember Nelson Mandela's funeral, him dying, and his funeral happening in the 80s. Now, as far as I know, Nelson Mandela is still alive right now. So that's a problem. There's a lot of people, I'm not just talking about hundreds, thousands or tens of thousands of people who remember Nelson Mandela dying in the 80s. And not just him dying, but very specific details about that. I've read stuff where people have talked about, I believe it's his wife, who gave a very, as they quoted it, very disingenuous speech at his funeral. details about her bodyguards. People remember who was the president of the United States of the time. There were a whole series of very specific events that took place during the funeral that people flat out remember as having happened. So this is where the effect gets its name, the Mandela effect. It is by no means the only example.
Oh, there's literally, I would say, hundreds of examples. And, the Mandela, obviously, that's a good one to start with, as it's, named after the man,
definition
right?
of the effect, yeah.
But, I guess what I want to get at now, just to start off, now that we know that, is some of the most popular examples, because they're, they're the ones that kind of blew my mind, and because they're popular, maybe you will be familiar with that. So, the most prominent example, if you Google the Mandela effect, you're no doubt going to come across this example, and it involves the Berenstein Bears. And I remember, Ryan, when you brought this to my attention, this is the example you gave me, and it blew my mind. So the Berenstein Bears, they're that was a children's book, and I grew up with those books. My mom bought tons of these things for me as I was growing up, and there was even a TV show, I believe, at one point. Yeah. And most of you probably read these books as children, especially if you grew up in the 80s and 90s like I did. So your parents probably read them to you, or maybe you read these or read those to your children. And my question to you is, how do you spell it and pronounce it? Do you spell it Berenstain, Berenstein, Bears, or is it Berenstein, Berenstein? Because when I was asked that question, I chose the latter, the Berenstein Bears. And that's apparently wrong. The correct way is the Berenstein Bears. And if it were just me who thought that, it wouldn't really be such a big deal. But there are enormous amounts of people who remember Berenstein Bears. And in fact, something that I found interesting is if you go on eBay and you look up the Berenstein Bears, like the books, that's how tons of people spell it. And it's funny because even the pictures of their books will have it spelled Berenstain. But when they're writing their description, they're writing it as they think of it, as they remember it, and they remember it as Berenstein Bears. So, I mean, that
I've even read real specific posts. It was a young woman who, she said, my parents were educators. They were always very big on pronunciation and spelling. And, growing up, I read the Berenstein Bears, and I very specifically remember because, she said at this time, it wasn't a common name in, the place that she grew up. And she wasn't exactly sure how to pronounce it. And so she specifically remembers her two parents, who were both teachers, sitting down with her and going through the pronunciation of the name of the book. And, very specifically, because, of course, a lot of people are going to go off with, well, you just misremembered it. That's the easiest answer for it. And, not only do we have thousands of people around North America and wherever else the books were sold, remembering it as Berenstein Bears, not Berenstein Bears. Here I found it curious because in the post, this girl was very concerned because she said, I clearly have memory of this. My parents are very big on spelling and pronunciation, and I remember my parents being so emphatic about how it was pronounced, Berenstein Bears. So, it's simply one of a laundry list of bizarre inconsistencies with, the memory of hundreds and thousands and maybe even hundreds of thousands of people about certain events, and apparently what the actual reality is.
And Ryan, that's a great example, because there's someone who remembers something very specifically in almost all of these, like you said, long laundry list of examples. So what I want to do before we jump into the big discussion of the theories of what this could be, I just want to run very quickly through some of these examples that are popular, and those of you who are listening who remember something a certain way, if you're familiar with this and you remember it differently, I want you to pop into the comments and tell us what you remember and why it's different from what we're saying. So, one example. Do you remember the character Curious George? He was a monkey, right? Well, do you remember him with having a tail? Because he doesn't have one. He is a monkey without a tail, but people distinctly remember him as having one. How about Jiffy Peanut Butter? Many people recall the product launching as Jiffy, and even recall commercials where the mother would whip up a sandwich in a jiffy. But this product was actually launched as Jif, J-I-F. The date the Challenger exploded. According to our history, it happened in 1986. But many people remember it as happening in 1984, and with others, it's 1985. And people swear by it, because one of the things, or another thing that they, was so prominent to them in their lives, was they were doing their finals in school or something like that. There was some reason why it was a prominent memory to them. Another popular issue is dead celebrities that are still alive. So like you probably seen the death of a celebrity in the media, and then later on you discover they're still alive. So some examples of this would be Betty White. She's been on everything from the Golden Girls to like those Snicker bar commercials. Well, a lot of people remember her having died. I think she's still alive.
She is, and she's literally older than sliced bread.
Okay, well, hopefully she won't watch this and tear you up over that. But anyway, now we'll move on to David Soul from Starsky and Hutch. This show came on in the 70s, and people recall seeing on TV that, and just, if you're one of these people, I'd like to hear from you in the comments. But people recall seeing on the TV that David Soul from the show was very depressed over his wife's cancer, and he had committed suicide. And apparently the police found him under a Christmas tree, and people remember him dying many, many years ago. And they specifically remember, the idea that the police found him under a Christmas tree, but apparently that, never happened, right? Remember the comedian Louis Anderson? Some people swear that they remember his death, and, that's why they canceled his TV show, but he's still alive and well. How about Muhammad Ali? Some people remember him passing in 2009, but he's still kicking it. So, there are many celebrity deaths that are remembered on dates that are much earlier, or, simply hasn't happened yet. And then there's other, non-death related glitches in this matrix. Like, does anybody remember those books, Where in Time as Carmen Sandiego? Well, if so, maybe you remember that just like I do. I remember seeing the cover, and she would have this yellow trench coat on, right?
With the fedora pulled down over her eyes.
Yeah, and dude, like, I am positive
it was Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, right?
Right.
That's what I remember.
Yeah, but maybe you're like me. Like, I vividly remember her wearing a yellow trench coat. Yeah. But if you go up on the internet now and you look it up, her trench coat is red. Apparently, it's always been red, right? But I can't even process that, because I know I saw her with a yellow trench coat. I asked my wife. She said the same thing.
I never even came across that one, but yeah, I'm I'm the same way. I remember it as yellow.
Okay, and there's the last example I'm going to give here of this. Again, it's really popular, right? Is the Disney movie 101 Dalmatians. Now, maybe you remember this old bitch of a woman, Cruella de Vil, right? Even her name, right, is like got cruel in it and devil. Cruella de Vil, right? Well, I distinctly remember the last name being spelled as Deville. Okay, so this is going to be very different now. I mean, that's the way I remember it, but it's actually spelled DE space VIL. I mean, the space makes such a big difference in how you would remember that name is spelled. And man, like, again, that's just very different. And one, when I was looking this up, one commenter even pointed out that if you start typing the name into the Google search engine, Google's autocomplete spells it as DEVILL2. It doesn't autocomplete it as the way it's allegedly done, right? The way that history now says it happened.
So even Google's misremembering this.
Even Google's misremembering this. The Disney website, Wikipedia, they show it as DE space VIL. Right, and I believe there's a case also with the movie Snow White with mirror. Maybe you remember it. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all? Right.
Yeah.
That's how I remember it. But apparently it's magic mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all. So, there's just so many different examples, and they're all kind of small, right? I mean, they're. Aside from like celebrity deaths and things like that, wouldn't you say that the details seem to be these small ones?
Well, not all the time. A lot of them are. A lot of the inconsistencies are, lines from movies. Life was like a box of chocolates.
Yes.
That's what a lot of people remember it as, but apparently is. Life is like a box of chocolates.
Well, see, that's the way I remember it, but I thought I read that, they said life was like a box of chocolates.
So a lot of them are tiny like that, but there's a couple of big ones. And now I first personally experienced this phenomenon, I believe when I was in junior high school. I was, however old you are, I think it was like 14 at the time. And I remember looking at a map, like, at school, there's fucking world maps everywhere. I remember looking at a world map and just like, it was almost like something like clicked in my brain, and not like a good click, but almost like something snapped. Because I was staring at Australia, and my brain couldn't compute where it was, because I remembered Australia being bigger and in a different place. And I thought, man, this map has to be screwed up or something like that. So I pulled out my social studies book and I looked at that. The internet was still new back then, so I didn't have ready access to anything like Google Earth or anything like that. So I grabbed a globe. I looked at some other maps and some other classrooms, and sure enough, they were all the same. Australia was the same size and shape, and in the same place on all these maps, but I remembered it completely differently. And I just thought, at the time, it really affected me. I think it was the first time I'd ever experienced the Mandela effect. And I just remember it so clear. I mean, I don't remember a lot of things from back then, but this is stuck in my mind so vividly. Like, I remember standing in. I even remember the teacher's name, Mr. Rowbottom.
Yeah, I remember that name too.
I remember standing in his classroom and just staring at the wall. I even remember what wall of the classroom it is. I could draw you a diagram even today. I mean, that's like 16, 17 years ago. And it was such a poignant thing in my memory. So I had forgotten about that for a decade or more. Went on with my life, and one day I'm cruising around on the internet looking up weird stuff because that's what I've always done, and I come across this thing called the Mandela effect, and I click on it, and I'm reading this article, and there's all it was a forum, and somebody had written like this little article and posted it up on a forum, and it had gotten a lot of attention because so many people, again, this was kind of not in the very early days of forums and stuff like that, but in the early days of when it was becoming popular, when the user numbers were high enough. And I think it was the first time that a lot of people had been exposed. Like, I'd never heard it called that, this effect, the Mandela effect. But then I see a post from somebody talking about Australia and them remembering it differently. And then a whole bunch of other people, jumping on the post and agreeing with them and saying, "Oh my God, I thought I was the only one." And like for me, like I literally got dizzy when I read it, because it was like my brain was almost short circuiting. I was having, cognitive dissonance, I guess. I wasn't sure what to think, because all those, and that feeling from all those years ago came creeping back. And now, I had gotten to the point when I was a kid where I was like, well, I guess I must just be stupid and remembering it wrong, and then to find like a whole little community of people who remembered an entire continent being in a different place and in a different shape and a different size in the exact same way that I did, was extremely jarring. And this is the other big one that personally I remember, and I've asked other people, a couple of years ago when I first read about this, and I hadn't thought about it, but then I immediately rushed outside. But the color of the sun, people remember when they were a kid. Remember, let's say back in the 80s and 90s, people remember the sun as being yellow. And now if you look at the sun, it's white, I mean, even Superman came here, got his powers because of our yellow sun. But if you look at our sun, it's pretty white.
And Ron, speaking of colors, right? Everybody remembers the Matrix trilogy, right? And one of the standout pieces in that movie was, do you take the red pill or the blue pill, right? And
the woman in the red dress.
And the woman in the red dress, right? Well, do you know that, because this is all altering memories, right? Well, a lot of people are seeing a similar thing happen with their memories where, things that they remember as being blue are now red, and things that were red are now blue. Like, they switch in between. And some people are wondering, actually, it's large groups of people that are wondering this stuff. Like, they remember like the Pepsi logo and all these different popular franchises that have these two primary colors, and they're switched now. And some people are questioning if like we really are in the Matrix, and if the color that based on the color swap or whatever, if you're in the real world or the the fake one, right? Are these signs that we're supposed to watch for to know exactly where we are?
So before we jump wholeheartedly into this, and I'm chomping at the bit to do it too, but I just want to take a moment to, I really want to encourage people, like, if you are interested in this and you're kind of on the fence about it, just go and do some looking around and look at some of the lists are nearly fucking endless. And there's so many people that remember things so differently. And I've read through dozens and dozens and dozens of these lists now. And it's, things as inconsequential as the spelling of Febreze, or, phrases from movies, or, Sex in the City or Sex in the City. Really go and look for yourself and have a look through some of these lists. And I think, like me and many other people, you'll be absolutely floored to read some of the ways that things actually are, as opposed to how you remember them.
Yeah, because it's not a small list. It's absolutely enormous. So if we're not hitting on the very specific things that do it for you, it's very possible that you will find it in one of these lists. Like, we just can't cover it all. There's just too many examples.
The whole podcast would literally just be us sitting here reading out these lists. So I guess the most important factor in doing that is to really get a sense of the scope of this thing, right? Because if it was just a couple of people on 2 or 3 different topics, then it's somewhat easily dismissible, right? As just straight up psychological they call it not conflagration, confabulation, the unintentional misremembering of things. That's an actual psychological thing. And if you try to talk to a psychological professional about something like this, that's what they're going to say is happening. But I don't know. It seems so so prevalent and so widespread that we all can't be that crazy.
No, and the thing is, like we mentioned earlier, some of these examples are so vivid. Like, I just can't understand how I remember it differently. Like, for me, the Berenstein Bears is one example, because I read those books so much growing up and had them read to me as a child that I can't imagine having that wrong. And same with the Where in Time is Carmen Sandiego. Like, I just so vividly it's a raincoat anyway. Of course it's yellow. That's the color that raincoats are, or trench coats, right? I mean, that's just the way, like, I can so easily picture that in my head. So, when I read that and then I went and Googled it and saw that it's red now, and I say red now because I can't, fathom it being red then when I saw it, but apparently it was, and it just blows my mind. So like that, those are probably the biggest examples for me, but this stretches beyond that, to like how you mentioned with like the location of Asia, Australia, sorry.
Yeah. I remember it being in the middle of nowhere, and like away from all other land masses. And if you look at it, it's right next to Indonesia.
Right. And some of these things are like, some people remember there being either 51 or 52 states in the United States, right? I mean, there's two large groups of people that, remember it very specifically one way. This stretches to where constellations are in the sky. The geography, it really does go on and on and on, through like prominent celebrity deaths, the dates of big events in history, like I mentioned earlier when the Challenger exploded, 9/11. I mean, some people swear that this happened on 9/10, right? I mean, honestly, everybody knows it is 9/11, but there are some people, it was a absolutely devastating thing that happened. It's something that nobody's ever going to forget. So that must be like crazy for the people that remember it on 9/10, to be told that the rest of the world remembers it as 9/11, because it's so big to them. You know what I mean? Like, how could you mess up a detail in such a big event like that.
So I guess the real question, because here we have a phenomenon that is crossing all subject boundaries. It's everything from the sun, the stars, geography, the spelling of specific names and words, colors, logos. It's everywhere. What in the world could be causing something like this?
Well, I'd like to start off with a couple theories that were put forward by a blogger named Reese. And the first of those theories is the crossing of parallel universes. And in this theory, a part of our universe crossed dimension with another. So, the people who remember things as they are currently recorded are still in the same universe. But the people who remember it differently, say you and I with certain things, we apparently cross over from the other universe.
So this is in reference to a theory called the many worlds theory, that along with our planet Earth and our universe with all the stars and planets as they exist, there are an infinite number of parallel realities, which would have just slight differences, little changes here and there, and the changes could be anywhere from, the only difference was that George Bush Sr. was never president, or it could be something enormous like Hitler won the Second World War. But that's the many worlds theory. So that's where they're what they're referring to.
So is this the same thing as the idea that, okay, this guy is going to go and shoot his wife, right? And he goes to do it and he does it. But in another reality, he doesn't do it. So the second that decision is made, it branches off, and one reality goes one way, and the other way that it would have went goes the other way, and now we have two different realities. But
that's a variation on the many worlds theory. So the many worlds theory just simply states that there are an infinite number of parallel realities. Then there's somebody came along and put an addendum onto that and said, well, what if it started out with one universe, and the very first decision was the Big Bang happened or the Big Bang didn't happen. So there's a universe where there is no universe and ours. And then every probability from then on until now, leading up to, this very moment, and all of the decisions that every animal, plant, person has ever made from the beginning of time until now, has resulted in the creation of another timeline.
Yeah,
a separate universe where you decided to stay in bed from work that day, and it just so happened that somebody came to work shooting. And then there's another universe where you went to work and ended up a paraplegic the rest of your life.
Okay, so that's one theory. The next theory that this Reese guy gave out, and to me this is the most interesting one. And honestly, I don't know where I lean with any of this stuff. I mean, it's so out there, all of it. But this one I found very interesting. So the idea, like we've all heard of, the paradoxes that can happen with time travel, right?
Yes.
So this guy said, in this theory, that somebody, from the future comes back to change something in the past. For example, remember the Y2K bug way back in, when we were turning to 2K, 2000.
Yeah. So is this the whole John Teeter?
No, but the idea being that everybody back then, I remember when we were in there, and I went through the millennium, and I remember everybody getting all up in how computers never, they couldn't do it. Like, they weren't, the software or whatever, it didn't go that high in date, and it was just going to have this catastrophic effect, because at the time, we had already begun to really rely on them for everything, from financial stuff to business to, just
airplanes,
everything.
Medical records, everything, yeah.
Everything. So there was this big fear that this was just going to fuck everything up. Medical equipment wouldn't work, stuff wouldn't it was just going to destroy the whole planet. That didn't happen, right? It didn't. But there's this theory that, for example, that maybe someone from the future came to the past. They prevented this Y2K bug. Now, it doesn't have to be Y2K. This is just one example. And in doing so, inadvertently changed small things in the future, such as the case with the Berenstein Bears. Now, it doesn't have to be the Y2K bug. It could be anything. It could be, like you said earlier, Hitler, maybe in a different reality, Hitler won, right? And that would have had a completely different impact on the world, I would think. So
yeah, we'd all be talking German.
And we'd be blonde with blue eyes. So it's possible that, what if someone from the future came back and, put was a key role, played a key role in getting the Allies and whoever involved in whatever needed to happen.
There actually is a time travel conspiracy around the whole Y2K thing, with a character known as John Teeter, who showed up on the internet. I can't remember what year it was, but he showed up posting, claiming that he was from the future, had pictures of his time travel equipment, and explained that Y2K had actually kicked off a massive civil war basically in North America, and the result of that being a lot of things going back to kind of an agrarian kind of society of farmers. America wasn't as connected as it once was. Everybody ate locally because there was no big shipping and agro conglomerates moving food and merchandise around the entire continent, and that they had developed this time travel technology, and he had come back because of the technology that they were using. Was getting, it was based off of very old technology, because they had the scrounge after the war to build stuff, and that he was sent back in time to get an old computer, just kind of like, NASA does this today. They have, ancient equipment that they're still using, and they have to, search like computer scrapyards to find parts for stuff that hasn't been made since the 80s. So his story anyway was that that's why he had come back in time originally. But, there was, and there's a whole lot to it. So if you're interested in the story of John Teeter, I believe last name is Titor. Definitely have a look at that. But that is there's claims that he went back and, just had a little chat with the programmers back in the early days when computers were coming out, and said, hey, what about when it rolls over to the year 2000? And just, left the implication at that and continued on his way. But, I digress from that. So, for me personally, when we're talking about, alternate realities and the crossing over, there's so many stories that, individual stories like we get on Effed Up Stories all the time of people, driving down the road, and all of a sudden they're in like a prehistoric world or some alien world where the animals are bizarre and the vegetation's bizarre. I love those kinds of stories, I believe in one of our missing persons episodes that we did, Strange Disappearances, I believe it was called. there's a man who flies into somewhere in Asia. I can't remember exactly what country, and he has a passport that's from some European country. It doesn't exist.
I remember. I know what you're talking about.
Right? And, is this what we're talking about? Is this an example of somebody, he just came from one that was so different that, and again, this guy apparently didn't notice anything until somebody looked at his passport and said, nice try, but you could have at least forged a passport from a country that exists, And, I mean, he subsequently disappeared out of the locked room that he had been placed in while they were trying to figure out what the hell, because everything about all of his documentation was indicating he was from this country that didn't exist, and they were legitimate government documents. And he had, passport stamps from all these other countries that, again, appeared completely legitimate. However, this guy, for all intents and purposes, appears to have come from a different reality. So, while talking about the many worlds theory, parallel dimensions, sounds like a very far-fetched and sci-fi thing, I think it's one of these things that happens far more than we'd ever be comfortable with if there was somehow to know of all of the situations where this has occurred. For you to, even if it's just anecdotal evidence, right? Just stories from people. At some point, you have to say, isn't it bizarre that so many people have so many stories about waking up and not recognizing the world that they're in. Another one was this woman. She woke up in her house, but it was different, and she was no longer married to the man she had been married to for 7 years. She was living with who used to be or was her ex-boyfriend from her perspective, but even the place that she worked, while it was the same, the layout was different. The department that she was in was on a different floor. Just, she had a real tough time of it. And I mean, while it's possible that this is somebody who's had a mental break, it's more than just one or two stories,
Yeah, and let's just step back from the multiple world theories for a second, because it's easy to go that route, especially with all the different theories. But honestly, I keep coming back to the idea, it's right in the phrase, a glitch in the matrix.
Mm-hmm.
And when we, as you already pointed out, with strange disappearances, I mean, when we did an episode on that, it wasn't just people. Like, we had stories of complete structures. Like, I remember one was like a school for people with, I don't know if it was psychic abilities or something like that. That just vanished. There's planes that vanished. I mean, everybody knows about things that happen in the Bermuda Triangle. And yeah, maybe there is a logical explanation for that. But there are a lot of unknown examples, not just in the Bermuda Triangle, but other places in the world where, people, large structures, I mean, even continents are different. They change or they disappear. And then we have all these little inconsistencies, like, oh, well, in this reality, Carmen Sandiego's trench coat is red, but in the other one it's yellow. And a lot of it really does remind me of video games or programs, right? Like, that's what we do. That's where the human race has gotten. We can code like these virtual realities. And
so we're talking about now the holographic universe theory.
The very idea that where we are, this whole thing is a simulation. Our body, you want to call it, an anchor for our soul or whatever. Maybe it's just a very, very advanced, module that we use. Like right now, in reality, we have virtual reality devices coming out beyond just the scope of sitting in front of a screen. We have like the Oculus Rift, We have the Valve, or was it the Vive?
The HTC Vive.
HTC Vive, and Sony is
Sony VR, HoloLens to a lesser degree.
Yeah, the HoloLens, I think they're aiming at a different.
It's augmented reality.
Yeah, it's augmented, and I think they're looking at using it in like medical. For example, you could have like an augmented list of things to pop up over someone's.
Basically, you get a virtual overlay over the real world that makes diagnosing and doing surgery and all that stuff so much easier.
Right,
and it goes even further than just the idea put forth in the Matrix series, where we're just stuck somewhere in a chamber with our brains hooked up. This holographic theory goes so far in depending on which one you read, that there is no physical body. We are very advanced computer simulations. That that there's nothing biological about us. That everything, our whole universe, is simulated.
And there's the very idea. I mean, what is DNA? It's code, right? It literally is code. It's not the way that we write code, but
it's quadernary instead of binary. That's the only difference. We use zeros and ones in machine code, and DNA uses A, C, T, and G, 4 different chemicals, and that's the entirety of what DNA is.
Right. So if we are code, and I mean everything has like a formula to it. I mean. Right down to you take a piece of wood, you have density, how porous is it, how there's so many different elements to it, but I mean it's a recipe, right? That's what we're talking about, is a recipe to make things what they are. That's what video game code is, and it follows the logic that is written for it. So what is the world, the universe, if it's not logic, right? What's physics? Well, it's the logic that weight and the weight and I don't know physics, but you know what I'm trying to say.
You're talking about the atomic weight and spin and charge characteristics of the different atoms that make up everything in our universe.
Yes, very eloquently said there, Ryan. Yeah, so I mean there is a rules in place is what I'm saying, but where do these rules come from, right? And that's when we get right down to what is the universe? And then you get into religion, right? It's like, well, it was made by God. So is God another term for the programmer who programmed this universe that we're in? And is this just one of many universes? Are there other programmers? It really is the chicken and the egg thing.
There really is some scientific precedent to the holographic universe theory. And there was a mathematician looking at some of the mathematics that we use to describe our universe, our the workings of the universe. And when he broke it down, he literally found buried in the mathematics that describe how our universe works this string of computer code. And it was so very familiar with him, or to him, because it's one of the oldest types of computer code that we've invented as a species. More specifically, this code is what we use whenever we're sending bits from one computing system to another one. So when I send you a text, there's a little bit of ancient code that we've been using forever that fact checks all the ones and zeros, because when you're dealing with things on the level of an electron, a 1 can get bumped to a 0 really easily. A little bit of interference can accidentally change a 1 to a 0 or a 0 to a 1. And then your message just comes out as a bunch of garbled nonsense. So there's a little bit of code that, I mean, I can't remember what it is. It's a type of algorithm, I do believe. And it checks back and forth just from the source to the receiver to ensure that the message was sent intact, and to fix any of those 0-1 change errors that may have occurred. So that very specific code, which is absolutely integral to any kind of electronic digital system that you make, you absolutely have to have a code like that, because without it, nothing would be able to communicate properly. So buried in the mathematics that describe our universe, this guy found that code. And, it's apparently been verified that that code exists. And whether it's just a fact of the natural universe and the way that information propagates through the universe, that, the universe has some built-in mechanism that checks for these 0-1 errors, or if it's the result of us actually living in a virtual universe, which is not to say that we're not real. If you feel, if you love and you hate and you have the whole range of emotions that we attribute to being a human, and as well as, I know, therefore I am, you believe, that you're conscious and you're sentient, then, this is no less quote unquote real than, what may be outside of the computer that we're in, if that's indeed the case. But it does definitely illustrate what, or it does, it really does open up the conversation and say, well, holy shit, all these inconsistencies that we're seeing with things like the Bermuda Triangle and UFOs and ghosts, and, all of a sudden, all that stuff becomes pretty explainable.
Well, hell, a ghost could be lag. It could be somebody that died.
Just the remnants of a deleted file.
Yeah, it's someone who died years ago, or probably will die in the future, and somehow, there's lag involved, and you're seeing little a skim of it. Just a little.
Well, what do you call it when you're playing a video game and it happens? And
you call it lag. You see some.
Well, you see your buddy
shit.
Ghosting.
Yeah, exactly, ghosting.
Oh shit! You must be lagging, dude. Your character's ghosting all over the screen.
Yeah, right. And they're literally warping from one area to the next, and it looks bizarre. And I know we have, people who watch the show who are gamers, and chime in, because honestly, there are a lot of similarities to how some of the errors in games happen.
And we've all been playing a game where we simply just fell through the world, didn't we?
You fell through the world and disappeared. There you go.
One of the NPCs could have been like, Jesus, where did he go?
Well, it wasn't that. Well, I'm not going to talk. I could talk forever about video games. But yes, I mean, that's exactly what it could be. You got this flight going over the Bermuda Triangle, they all disappear. Well, that's a glitch in the Matrix, some bad fucking code, right? Just, and in fact, things that happen to us, when someone has a heart attack or a stroke, is that just, code gone bad? I mean, yeah, we could say, oh, it's the food you eat, this, that. Well, maybe that's the equivalent of going on the internet without a condom, or without virus software or whatever. The stuff that you put yourself into is dangerous, and you're constantly, chipping away at that code, or making it vulnerable to, go bad, to have an error. And that's the result, right? Is you have this critical failure. What happens to your computer when you have a critical failure? Well, you get the blue screen of death, right? So it's kind of freaky when you think of it that way. I don't necessarily say that I subscribe to that, but I mean, it's very possible. I mean, right now we're seeing virtual reality. We're finally getting to that stage. In fact, I think it's June or July that I think the Oculus Rift is out first, and then it's
Oculus is already out.
Oh, is it?
Yep. It just got released. The HTC Vive is next.
Yeah.
And here's there is another little bit to this. when we talk about the universe and reality, there is a higher mathematical probability. Now, this is a bit of a train of a thought, but somebody's actually sat down and worked this out, that mathematically, it's much more likely that we're living in a simulation of a simulation of a simulation of a simulation many times deep than we are actually living in the real universe. And the theory goes that some advanced race, let's just say, for instance, the human race, right? It's a million years more advanced than what we are right now. And what they did to try and understand the universe that they're living in, they built a extremely complex and true to life simulation using, super advanced quantum computers that are able to handle all the different variables of the universe. And they started running the simulation, and the simulation, runs at, a billion times faster or a million times faster than real life. So they're able to watch the evolution of the universe. One day we should be able to do this, right? But this, the theory goes that a super intelligent race creates this type of a simulation. They have a massive amount of data on the universe, and they're able to model it very true to the real world. So they run that simulation for 10 years, which is the equivalent of 14.7 billion years. And the result of that is that inside the simulation, beings evolve and grow to a level of technological sophistication where they can create their own super advanced quantum simulations. Now, to them, their simulated universe is completely real. They live, they die, they feel pain, they feel fear, they do all the things that you and I do, or that our creators do in the real universe. But along that, along their technological trajectory, they eventually invent super advanced quantum computers that can create a model of the universe. So they do it to try and understand how the universe was created, not knowing that they're a simulation. And so they run their simulation, and again, they run it so that it's a billion times faster than what the real world is, even though from the perspective inside of the simulation, things are just running at a normal time. And, over the course of 10 years, these simulated creatures arise that make their own quantum computer and create their own simulation. So statistically speaking, we are far more likely, mathematically, to be in a simulation inside of a simulation inside of a simulation ad infinitum, ad nauseum, than we are to be in the actual real universe. Now tell me if that's not spooky.
Oh, it's spooky, but I guess the real question that I would have is, am I an avatar? Like, is my soul actually out in the real universe controlling this avatar?
Not as part of this theory. As
because
part of
that's
this
what
theory,
scares me. Because
you're just code. There is no physical you.
Okay, because that's what's scary. Because if we're just code, this is the whole. Do robots have feelings? Should we treat them like people? Because to them, they do, but they're coded that way.
Well, we haven't created any sentient code yet.
No, we haven't. But in science fiction, that's a thing. For example, you're playing Grand Theft Auto 5, right? And the characters. Not at the moment. No, not at the moment. But take for example that the NPCs or whatever in the game, they have a very small amount of AI. We'll say, if you start shooting a gun or causing havoc, they'll drive away. They'll act panicked or whatever. That's the extent of that. They're coded to behave, but they obviously don't want to get shot. They don't want to get run over. To them, is that more than just a code, just an instinctual thing? Do they actually, is it a real fear for them? Do you know what I mean?
There's two things to take into account. One being that, A, your instinctual fear of things is just biological programming. right? You're just being programmed to, I mean, we can specifically lobotomize people in a certain way where they'll have no fear for their own safety. That's possible. We can do that, right? So you can go in and burn that part of the code right out of their brain, and they'll happily fucking walk right off the edge of a cliff, right? You take that instinct away. Now that's literally just biological code that's written into you. It doesn't make you any less real or any less conscious, but let's not delude ourselves into thinking that is just a product of selected traits over the course of billions of years that have said, and all animals pretty much, get away from danger because your DNA really wants to move on to the next generation, and you can't do that if you're dead. Now, the other part to add in here is that, does code have a soul? Well, I mean, we don't even know if we have a soul. We don't even know what the hell a soul is. I would argue that what everybody refers to as a soul, right, is easily referred to as just your consciousness, right? Like when we use the word soul, but what you're really talking about is that, okay, I don't mind if my body dies as long as my ego and my personal identity and my memories and all the things I've learned and the way that I think survives in some kind of an intact format, even if that's non-physical, right? We say soul for short, the short in that explanation. That's the definition of soul, really. So once code or a machine, again, the machine just being the body, the code is what we're talking about, was the really important part. Once the code becomes self-aware, once it reaches human level consciousness, is it alive? And I say yes, because we're just existing within a biological machine. And if you were able to take that consciousness, if you were able to pattern their brain and download all of that information into another body, whether it be a biological replica or just a solid state hard drive with a virtual environment or just a machine body, then you would still say, well, that's a person. They're alive. They're a copy of a person. And I think the same goes with any one day somebody is going to finish the line of code, hit enter, and the fucking thing's going to be aware, right? And that's going to be the beginning of the technological singularity.
And Terminator.
And, well, possibly. It's possible, but there are things being put in place to protect us from that.
But there's always a bad guy in the background saying, I want you to live for you.
So I think the important part, though, is to say that once something is aware, once it is conscious, it is alive, and the essence of the soul is the consciousness. And if there's some way to destroy consciousness, then I think the soul is gone too, because I think that's what the soul is. That's all it is.
That's a scary thought there, Ryan. Because that could be us, right?
But if it is, right? It's either A, you're going to end up in some never-ending paradise, or B, you're going to not exist, in which case, what difference does it make?
Yeah, but I still don't like it. So let's just let's just leave it there, because I mean, honestly, this topic could be one of the biggest topics, because you get right into the purpose of life, the soul, what's religion, what are we, what's the point. This could go as big as you want to go.
Well, I mean, we did go pretty big today, and it is a topic that...
Go big or go home, right?
That's right. And I'm already home, so let's go big.
Me too.
I think we've obviously gone very far afield here today. We've talked about the got right down to the very brass tacks of the nature of reality, and that's because this topic is in order to address this topic, you have to address the nature of reality, because what we're talking about here is something so powerful that it literally could be altering not just our perception of reality, but how reality actually exists. I'll just throw this theory is one I came across, that this is actually being caused by something from the future, some kind of powerful, something like the particle accelerator at CERN, but a million times more advanced. And this thing is accelerating particles to such a degree that some of the exotic particles that are being caused from these collisions are actually traveling backwards through time and affecting things after they've already happened. And that, the human brain isn't built to constantly rewire itself to remember. Now, some people may be less susceptible to this than others, and they're able just to swallow the new paradigm because reality has changed, the past has changed, so the future has changed, and your brain rewires itself accordingly. But there may be some of us who our brains aren't very good at rewiring itself like that, and it's very. And I've also seen that this may be a natural phenomenon, something that's been happening since the beginning of the universe, where big events in the future cause ripples so powerful that they affect the past, and that it's only as our society begins to get more and more connected and more complex that we can begin to identify these small changes that happen, or big changes in some cases. So that's pretty much all I got on the Mandela effect.
Well, yeah, honestly, like other than just listing off a million examples, I mean, this is just a real thought experiment. There's just a million different ways you can think. There's a million different ways. So what that's our take on it. That's what we thought of. I'm interested to hear what you guys think, not just on the theories in general or what you think happens, or are we actually in a virtual reality environment? Are we actually here? What is the soul? But also examples, like I'm very interested to hear of examples of the Mandela effect that I haven't heard before. What popular media have you saw that differs from the norm? What celebrities have you seen that you're sure that died that are still alive? Why are you so sure that this is the case? I'm interested to hear that. So if you have anything to add on that, just blow it up in the comment section. I think it'll be a very interesting place for us to share stories and just read and theorize on what exactly is happening here. What world are we in? How does this all make sense? So with that said, outside of that, again, if you have an effed up story of your own, we'd love to get that from you. Get it on the website and into a podcast, which you can do at the official website, which is effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. And we are selling very limited Effed Up Stories t-shirts. They're the only ones that will ever exist with this artwork. You can get that on the official website. Some other stuff, artwork, custom podcasts, and of course, you can also donate. Why donate? Well, besides helping us do greater things with the show, you could win a free t-shirt or whatever we got going, because 2 people are getting a free t-shirt. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the episode, and be sure to drop by the official site to check out all that stuff. And big changes coming soon for the better. Thank you for listening, everybody.
Have a good night. We're educators. They were always very big on pronunciation and spelling. And, growing up, I read the Berenstein Bears, and I very specifically remember, because, she said at this time, it wasn't a common name in the place that she grew up, and she wasn't exactly sure how to pronounce it, and so she specifically remembers her two parents, who are both teachers, sitting down with her and going through the pronunciation of the name of the book. And, very specifically, because, of course, a lot of people are going to go off with, well, you just misremembered it. That's the easiest answer for it. And, not only do we have thousands of people around North America and wherever else the books were sold, remembering it as Berenstein Bears, not Berenstein Bears. Here I found it curious because in the post, this girl was very concerned because she said, I clearly have memory of this. My parents are very big on spelling and pronunciation, and I remember my parents being so emphatic about how it was pronounced, Berenstein Bears. So it's simply one of a laundry list of bizarre inconsistencies with the memory of hundreds and thousands and maybe even hundreds of thousands of people about certain events, and apparently what the actual reality is.
And Ryan, that's a great example because there's someone who remembers something very specifically in almost all of these, like you said, long laundry list of examples. So what I want to do before we jump into the big discussion of the theories of what this
it's a situation where a lot of people remember Nelson Mandela's funeral, him dying, and his funeral happening in the 80s. Now, as far as I know, Nelson Mandela is still alive right now. So that's a problem. There's a lot of people, and I'm not just talking about hundreds, thousands or tens of thousands of people who remember Nelson Mandela dying in the 80s, and not just him dying, but very specific details about that. I've read stuff where people have talked about, I believe it's his wife, who gave a very, as they quoted it, very disingenuous speech at his funeral. Details about her bodyguards. People remember who was the president of the United States of the time. There were a whole series of very specific events that took place during the funeral that people flat out remember as having happened. So this is where the effect gets its name, the Mandela effect. It is by no means the only example.
Oh, there's literally, I would say, hundreds of examples. And, the Mandela, obviously, that's a good one to start with, as it's, named after the man,
definition,
right?
Of the effect, yeah.
But, I guess what I want to get at now, just to start off, now that we know that, is some of the most popular examples, because they're, they're the ones that kind of blew my mind, and because they're popular, maybe you will be familiar with that. So, the most prominent example, like if you Google the Mandela effect, you're no doubt going to come across this example, and it involves the Berenstein Bears. And I remember, Ryan, when you brought this to my attention, this is the example you gave me, and it blew my mind. So the Berenstein Bears, that was a children's book, and I grew up with those books. My mom bought tons of these things for me as I was growing up, and there was even a TV show, I believe, at one point. Yeah. And most of you probably read these books as children, especially if you grew up in the 80s and 90s like I did. So your parents probably read them to you, or maybe you read these or read those to your children. And my question to you is, how do you spell it and pronounce it? Do you spell it Berenstain, Berenstein, Bears, or is it Berenstein, Berenstein. Because when I was asked that question, I chose the latter, the Berenstein Bears. And that's apparently wrong. The correct way is the Berenstein Bears. And if it were just me who thought that, it wouldn't really be such a big deal. But there are enormous amounts of people who remember Berenstein Bears. And in fact, something that I found interesting is if you go on eBay and you look up the Berenstein Bears, like the books, that's how tons of people spell it. And it's funny because even the pictures of their books will have it spelled Berenstain. But when they're writing their description, they're writing it as they think of it, as they remember it. And they remember it as Berenstein Bears. So, I mean, that
I've even read real specific posts. There was a young woman who, she said, my parents.
Put a link in the description to this video, and of course, if you have an effed up story of your own on the paranormal or whatever, we'd love to get that from you. Get it onto the website and into a podcast. So to do that, you can go on to the official website, effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. And just go to the menu, hit submissions, fill out the form, hit submit. We have it. We'll get it online and into a podcast. And with that said, let us jump into the exciting topic of the Mandela effect. So in a nutshell, the Mandela effect refers to an enormous amount of people who remember details, not just wrong, but very specifically so. And that it might not sound like much in itself, but what we are going to get at here is household terms that you will most likely very vividly remember in one of two ways. And the way that it is currently in our history books, or the way that, it was, is very different likely from the way that you remember that. So, I mean, this could be, again, it could be the reality of different dimensions or realities splitting off as things happen. It could be a multitude of things, and if this sounds really confusing, then just sit back as we start taking baby steps through the examples, because, personally, it blew my mind, and many people that I've explained this to, it's blown their mind. So if you're not familiar with it, it's possible that it's going to blow your mind. So let's just get down to probably the most popular example, and the most popular example that I think possibly, and Ryan, you can jump in here if you can think of a better one, but it's probably the Berenstein Bears.
Well, I guess the obvious one to mention first before we get
Mandela,
into is Mandela, since the effect is named after him, and
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight, we have a very exciting episode. We've been waiting to this episode for a long time. We're actually going to be doing it on the Mandela effect. And in short, it involves many memories that you've had of past things in your childhood, things you grew up with that are completely different than you remember them. It has to do with perhaps celebrities you remember dying that are still alive, and so on. And it all comes down to different theories with different realities that have come through, possible time travel. It's a really, really wild topic. So we're excited to do that. And the other thing that I want to throw out there, besides the usual, is that we finally have our official Effed Up Stories t-shirts for sale. They're extremely limited. I can't stress that enough. So if that's something you want, head on over to the official site. And as well, because I didn't want to have a 20-minute intro, because we have a lot of new stuff coming, guys. I've done up a separate video that shows the t-shirts, other things that we're going to be doing, and how you can get it. And as well, we're giving away 2 free t-shirts, one to our eccentric donator, who of which without this wouldn't have been possible, and one is going out to a random donator. So if you were one of those people, you could very well have won a free t-shirt. So be sure to check that video out. I'll see if I can put